Now, remember, dividends are simply returns to shareholders, and information about dividends, you can only find it in two places. You can only find it in your retained income note and in your trading other payables as shareholders for dividends. And let me just explain the notes quickly before I even continue. Okay. A company declares two types of dividends, which is your interim dividends for the current year and final dividends for the current year. But please note that a company only pays two types of dividends. Interim dividends, the company will declare interim and pay them, but it doesn't pay final. But for this year, that is. But it will pay final for last year. You remember, final for last year, whenever you declare dividends, you're creating an obligation, which is a current liability. You're creating an obligation because you have made a promise, which is legally binding to the shareholders that you are going to pay dividends, unless circumstances that were not within your control occur. Okay. The company pays two types of dividends, this year's interim dividends and last year's final. There's a difference between what I've just said right now, and I need you guys to pay attention to that. Declares, we declare two types of dividends, which is this year's interim plus this year's final. But the company only pays two types of dividends. Now, as I've said, the difference between declaring and paid, we declare two types of dividends, this year's interim and this year's final. We only pay two types of dividends, which is this year's interim and last year's final. Okay? I hope you highlighted that because it's very important. Okay. Okay, let me just continue. Now, when we prepare dividends paid note, we need retained income note to be prepared because we only need your interim dividends as well as this year's final in your retained income note. And we also need trade and other payables, which tell us about this year's final and last year's final. Okay. If interim and or current year's dividends are not provided, you will need to use the following to calculate them. Normally, you use the percentage given, and they'll tell you that you need to take that percentage and multiply it by the number of shares. Or they will simply give you a dividends ratio. Dividends ratio is it falls under ratios and analysis, and, and it'll be dividends per share. Normally, when we calculate dividends per share, it will be your ordinary dividends divided by number of shares that were issued. Okay, just remember that. Now, the note will look like this. Okay, you'll have shareholders for dividends, which is from the previous year that you will get in trade and other payables. Shareholders for dividends represents your final dividends that you were owing last year. So those final dividends, we have to pay them this year. That's why we show it in brackets. And then you're going to have dividends on ordinary shares, which is found in retained income. That is a combination of your interim for this year plus your final for this year. So you're going to put it in brackets because both of them will be paid. And then you are going to add this year's final dividends. The reason why you're adding them back, it is because they were not actually paid. They'll only be paid in the next financial year. And you'll be left with dividends paid, which is simply last year's final plus this year's interim. Okay, let us look at this example here. Use this information to prepare your dividends paid note. As I've said, we need these two statements for us to prepare dividends paid note. So we need this year's interim and final and also need last year's final, of which I said to you, if you want final dividends, you'll find them in trade and other payables. And just like they are given to you here, your final dividends here will simply be that 24,000 will be for this year and the 19,000 will be for the previous financial year. For this year, your interim will be 16,000. And if I was to ask you, how much do we have as total dividends declared? What will be your answer? Your total dividends declared, it is just your interim dividends plus your final dividends. of which are given to you in the retained income notes. Those will be your total dividends declared. And how much will be my dividends paid? Dividends paid will be last year's final of 19,000 plus this year's interim of 16,000. Let me check. If I take 16,000 and I add it with last year's final, which was 19,000, I will simply get 35,000, which represents dividends paid. All right, as I've said, your dividends paid will just be this 19,000 plus the 16,000. That represents your dividends paid. Dividends declared will be this 16,000 plus the 14,000. Those will be, the 24,000. Those will be your dividends declared. But you realize that we only need this one here from retained income to prepare our note. Let's prepare our note quickly. It'll start with shareholders for dividends from the previous year. We put it in brackets because that was last year's current liability. So we need to pay it for this year, which is 19,000. And your dividends for this year will simply be your dividends on ordinary shares, which is this year's interim plus final, which was given to you as 40,000. So both of them should be paid. But in essence, we are going to add this year's final back because it was not paid. And when we add it back, we'll end up getting your interim plus your final dividends. Your dividends paid will be 35,000 rand. Right? Try this one quickly. Let me give you 5 minutes. All you have to do is to prepare your dividends on ordinary shares note. Okay, not your dividends on ordinary shares, your dividends paid note. Quickly do it. All right, you should be done. You'll realize that you are missing this year's final. Obviously, it's easy for you to get dividends paid because it'll just be that 26,000 plus the 16,000, which will give you 42,000 as dividends paid. But it's easy for you to calculate your final dividends. The final dividends will be 34,000. So how did I get that 34,000? I simply use the reverse operation rule. For me to get your total dividends on ordinary shares, you normally take your interim dividends, you add with your final. Because I gave you this, all you have to do is to minus your interim dividends, and then you'll get this final dividends here, which is the 34,000 rand. Okay, now that enables you to calculate your dividends paid, of which you could have done using the interim for this year and last year's final. So you will simply take last year's interim and, well, you will take last year's final and put it in brackets because that has to be paid. Okay, let me just look for the right slide. All right, so it'll be last year's final of 26,000. You put it in brackets. This year's interim plus final for this year, it'll be 50,000, which was given to you in your retained income note. You just add back a current year's final, which is 34,000, then you will get dividends paid as 42,000. Okay, try classwork 4 quickly. Okay, now jump to classwork 5. All right, this is classwork 4. Keep on going to classwork 5. This is classwork 4. Quickly calculate dividends paid note. Just calculate dividends paid, prepare the dividends paid note. Quickly, you have 5 minutes. All right. First of all, you didn't have this year's final. You also were not given your dividends on ordinary shares. But guys, please check your retained income note. You can actually manipulate all of that to calculate your dividends on ordinary shares. You are given this final amount here of 63,400. Take that minus 53,400 minus 60,000. It will give you a balancing figure of 50,000, which is your dividends on ordinary shares. Once you have dividends on ordinary shares, you just minus this 12,000. It will give you your final dividends for the current year, which is 38,000. So when you calculate your dividends paid, it will just be 12,000, which is your interim, plus last year's final of 50,000. And you're done. Dividends paid will be 62,000. Otherwise, you can follow this process of calculating your dividends paid by taking last year's final, and we are paying that, and you will subtract this year's interim plus final and add back this year's final. Your dividends paid will be 62,000. Right? Try the next example quickly. Note that you can calculate your dividends on ordinary shares for this year. Okay, and that's all you can do. Oh, you also have last year's final, but you can't do anything because you're not given this year's interim or final. So they need to give you more information, and this is the additional information here. Okay. Oh no. Oh, this is the previous one. It's fine. Let me just do this. Guys, answers. Try this task one quickly, and here is the additional information. Use that to calculate dividends paid for the current year. You've got 5 minutes, okay? All right, I gave you even an extra time there. Please note that with this information that is given here, the only thing that you could calculate was dividends on ordinary shares, which amounted to 50,000. Okay, I'll show you how I calculated that interim dividend. So the interim dividend, I simply used the last information that was given, where they told us that we declared dividends and they gave us a percentage that we declared, which will be the percentage of dividends declared. When you declare dividends, it's always a percentage of shares issued, not ordinary shares that are authorized, only issued. Okay, so I simply took 50,000 shares that were issued in issue at that time, and I multiplied it by 25%, which is the same as 25 cents. 25 cents is the same as 25 divided by 100, and that'll give me 12,500. If you're wondering where I got the 12,500, that's where I got it. And once I have your interim dividends, I do have my dividends on ordinary shares. Remember, dividends on ordinary shares represents your total dividends for the current year, which is made up of interim dividends for the current year plus final dividends for the current year. And when I calculate my final dividends for the current year, it gave me 37,500, which will be my shareholders for dividends, which is the final dividends for the current year. With all that information, I can now prepare my dividends paid note. When I prepare my dividends paid note, I will start with last year's amount, which is 60,000, and you subtract this year's interim plus final of 50,000, and you add back this year's final of 37,500. You will get your dividends paid at 72,500. Okay, try out this last classwork. We have 5 minutes. Here you realize that there was no way you can calculate your final or your interim dividends for the current year. So they gave you enough information for you to calculate this year's final dividends by taking the 60,000 times it by 35%, and that'll give you your final dividends for the current year, which is 21,000. With the final dividends for the current year, I will go back to my retained income and simply put in the 21,000 there as final dividends. And then when you add the 21,000 with the 12,000, it will give you your dividends on ordinary shares. Please note that you could have calculated your dividends paid by just taking the 12,000, which is this year's interim plus last year's final 50,000. And it was just going to give you 63,000, which is your dividends paid. Obviously, with no hassle, you have your answer. But if you want to go the long route, this is how you will go about it. I have my final dividends there, and I have just shown you how I calculated 33,000. 33,000 is just the 12,000 interim for this year plus 21,000 final for this year, and it will give me my dividends on ordinary shares for the current year. Okay. And with that information, I'm ready to go to prepare my dividends paid. And when I prepare my dividends paid, last year's dividends, we're going to put it in brackets because it has to be paid this year. And we're going to subtract dividends on ordinary shares for the current year, which is this year's interim plus this year's final. And then you add this year's final. And it'll give you dividends paid of 62,000 as we calculated earlier on. Okay. In the next video, we will be doing interest paid when interest is not capitalized, only when interest is not capitalized, okay? So this is what we will be dealing with. Okay, I think that's all I can give you for now. Also, please don't forget to subscribe and click the notification button to ensure that you get notifications whenever I upload videos.